The wild capitalism that emerged from the ruins of the Soviet Union came as a shock to millions of people. Prices increased dozens of times, businesses closed, and people were left without jobs or their usual source of income. Neither the government, nor industry, nor ordinary citizens were prepared for how quickly a market economy would replace the planned system. But the Gorky automobile plant and its Gazelle seem to have anticipated these changes. The Gazelle is developed back in the Soviet Union, a country where private shops, independent transport operators, and small businesses in the Western sense barely existed. That is why many believe the factory was wasting resources on a truck that simply would have no buyers. But they were wrong. When the Gazelle entered the market in 1994, it turned out to be a vehicle almost perfectly suited to the new reality. Open-air markets, private shops, construction crews, minibus services, and people who now had to find their own way to make a living. The Gazelle quickly became one of the main working tools of the new economy, and one of the most significant vehicles of the post-Soviet era. In this video, I will explain why the Soviet Union needed a truck that seemed unnecessary at the time, how the Gazelle could have become Azerbaijani rather than Russian, and what actually connects it to the Ford Transit. One of the strangest paradoxes of the Soviet automotive industry was the almost complete absence of light-duty trucks. A huge country with a developed automotive industry went for decades without one of the most important classes of commercial vehicles. But when you look at how the Soviet economy worked, this paradox actually makes sense. A private business owner has to consider the cost of the vehicle, fuel consumption, driver wages, repairs, and how efficiently the truck is used. In such conditions, sending a 5-ton truck to deliver just 1 ton of cargo would simply make no financial sense. In the Soviet Union, vehicles belonged to state enterprises. Fuel was distributed according to government plans, and the costs of individual deliveries disappeared inside the larger system. The goal was not to make money from each trip, but to fulfill the plan and deliver the cargo using whatever vehicle was available. That is why small shipments were often carried by much larger GAZ and Gazelle trucks. Specialists understood that this led to unnecessary costs, but the country had almost no independent shops, cafes, workshops, or private transport operators that actually needed a light-duty truck. Goods were delivered in large batches, from warehouses to state-owned stores, and for such a system, a medium-duty truck seemed like a perfectly acceptable solution. Besides, creating a new vehicle required production capacity, equipment, suppliers, and a place in the next 5-year plan. Soviet factories were already struggling to meet demand for trucks needed by the military, agriculture, construction, and industry. Few people were willing to sacrifice valuable production capacity for a smaller commercial vehicle. Attempts were made, however. Back in the mid-1950s, the Gorky automobile plant developed the GAZ 56, a fairly modern truck for its time, but putting it into mass production was considered impractical. As a result, a huge gap remained between small vans and full-size medium-duty trucks. In the 1970s, it was partially filled by vans from the Yerevan automobile plant, but they could not replace a proper flatbed truck. In practice, the only mass-produced vehicle of this size with a cargo bed was the UAZ Bukanka. It was well suited for rural areas and poor roads, but far from ideal for urban deliveries. Low fuel prices also played a role. The government regularly demanded that transport companies save gasoline, but drivers and fleet managers were not paying for fuel out of their own pockets. As a result, calls to conserve fuel could sound almost like asking someone to save the air entering the carburetor. Many people saw gasoline as an almost free resource, no more expensive than water. By the early 1980s, urban trade, consumer services, and the transportation of small shipments had grown significantly in the Soviet Union. As a result, the need for a light-duty truck became increasingly obvious. This was especially true because the vans produced by the Yerevan automobile plant had extremely poor build quality, even by Soviet standards, and clearly could not handle the tasks expected of them. Europe already provided a clear example. Ford Transit, Mercedes-Benz T1, and Iveco Daily had already created a huge market for light commercial vehicles. In the summer of 1983, the Soviet government officially recognized a special need for light delivery vehicles, and ordered NAMI to develop a family of trucks with a payload capacity of around 1.5 tons. Part of the work was carried out by the Ulyanovsk automobile plant, while a new diesel engine was being developed by the Ulyanovsk engine plant. Initially, production was planned at UAZ, but the factory was already fully occupied building off-road vehicles and bukankas, many of which were supplied to the military. The armed forces had no intention of giving up production capacity for a civilian truck. Therefore, a separate factory was planned for the new vehicle in Kirovabad, Azerbaijan. There was almost no automotive industry in the region, but for the Soviet Union, this approach was common. Major industrial projects were often placed where the government wanted to create jobs and strengthen the industrial base of a republic. In 1984 and 1985, NAMI built experimental NAMI 0267 all-metal vans. They featured a semi-forward control layout, a high roof body, a sliding side door, an experimental diesel engine, and dual rear wheels. At the same time, the NAMI 3305 flatbed truck was created using the same platform, with a payload capacity of around 1.5 tons. After testing and further development, the technical documentation was transferred to the factory under construction in Kirovabad, and the future production model received the designation GAZ 3727. But then, an armed conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan began to escalate. Combined with the economic crisis, reduced funding, and the breakdown of industrial connections, it caused construction of the factory to slow down and eventually stop completely. A new production site had to be found for the project. The choice fell on the Bryansk automobile plant, which produced heavy multi-axle tractors and military vehicles. By the late 1980s, military orders were declining, production capacity was becoming available, and the factory needed a civilian product. However, instead of simply putting the existing NAMI design into production, engineers in Bryansk decided to heavily redesign the vehicle. The British company IAD Limited was brought into the project, and the original Kiaz gradually turned into an almost completely new family called BAZ 3778. But that is a story for another time. Throughout the 1980s, the Gorky automobile plant felt quite confident about its future. Its production lines were busy. GAZ trucks had steady demand in both military and civilian sectors, and the waiting list for Volga sedans showed no signs of disappearing. So, even with the growing economic crisis, the future of the company seemed not exactly perfect, but at least secure. That is why many people were surprised when GAZ management decided to develop a light-duty truck on its own initiative. Meanwhile, economic reforms were already beginning in the Soviet Union, changes that were nothing short of an ideological shift. State enterprises were gradually given more financial independence and were expected to take responsibility for their own results. They still had to fulfill government production targets, but they also had to control costs, reduce expenses, and find ways to operate with less state support. Then, in 1988, the law on cooperatives effectively opened the door for independent private businesses. Small factories, workshops, cafes, shops, and private transport companies began appearing across the country. Their owners were known as cooperators, essentially the first legal private entrepreneurs of the late Soviet period. Together with them came a new type of customer. A small business no longer needed a large state-owned ZIL truck. It needed its own affordable and practical vehicle for everyday work. And this was where fuel economy stopped being just an abstract figure. Previously, sending a 4-ton GAZ 53 truck to carry 800 kilograms of cargo was not a major concern because the costs disappeared inside the state system. Now, fuel, repairs, and driver wages had to be paid from the owner's own income. It seemed obvious that the economy itself was creating demand for a light-duty truck. But surprisingly, the initiative from GAZ management had many opponents. Skeptics could be found both among factory specialists and in government ministries. Many believed GAZ was wasting resources on a vehicle that would have almost no market. The economic crisis was still seen as a temporary problem that the powerful Soviet system would overcome. Meanwhile, cooperators were often viewed by officials as unreliable and short-lived businessmen who did not justify creating an entirely new family of vehicles. However, GAZ chief truck designer Alexander Butusov had a completely different opinion. He had already taken part in the development of the GAZ 3727 project. Under his leadership, Gorky specialists helped create the van for the future factory in Kirovabad. Because of this experience, Butusov understood that such a vehicle was desperately needed not only by the emerging entrepreneurs, but also by GAZ itself. Fortunately, the factory's general director, Boris Vidyayev, shared this view. He gave the green light to active development of the future Gazelle, even though there was no direct government order to create such a vehicle. Additional state funding was not required either. GAZ used part of the money allocated for research and development projects. Soviet automobile factories could decide how to use these funds, and this time the management chose not to spend them on another promising passenger car project like a new Volga, but to invest in a light-duty truck. In the end, the fate of the Gazelle was decided by Vidyayev himself, who acted more on his own initiative than on instructions from the ministry. When creating the Gazelle, engineers decided to use as many components from the Volga as possible. The engine, transmission, braking system, and many other proven parts were already suitable for the new vehicle, although some of them had to be reinforced or redesigned. This high level of commonality with the Gorky passenger car significantly reduced both development time and production preparation costs, which ultimately helped keep the vehicle affordable. However, it quickly became clear that the unibody construction used in the NAMI project was not suitable for GAZ. Truck production in Gorky was built around a frame. The frame itself moved along the assembly line, gradually receiving its components, systems, and cab. GAZ also preferred a strong ladder frame because it provided the vehicle with the necessary durability reserve. Interestingly, in Bryansk, engineers continued working with the British company IAD on a van with a unibody design, while Gorky followed the more traditional path used for Soviet trucks. Despite the extensive use of Volga components, the GAZ 33002 received a solid front axle with leaf springs. Its basic layout was borrowed from the NAMI light-duty truck, but it was heavily redesigned. According to the engineers, this solution would better withstand harsh operating conditions than a more modern independent suspension. The Gazelle cab turned out not only streamlined and attractive, but also spacious enough for 3 people. Inside, the relatively compact vehicle seemed larger than it actually was. This effect was created by the large glass area, thin pillars, and the sharply sloped hood that visually continued the huge windshield. At the same time, the resemblance to the Ford Transit was immediately noticeable. By the late 1980s, GAZ had no experience creating a modern light commercial vehicle family with a gross weight under 3.5 tons. Therefore, the factory closely studied successful European vehicles, especially the Iveco Daily and the 1986 Ford Transit. The Transit became one of the main references when designing the appearance of the future Gazelle. The accusations of copying were not completely unfounded. The overall proportions of the cab, the ribs on the side panels, and even the door handles looked similar. But some of these similarities were simply the result of the requirements of the class itself. When the engine is mounted at the front, the cab has to fit 3 people, and the vehicle's gross weight is limited to 3.5 tons. There is not much room for dramatic design experiments. In addition, Gazelle designers had to use headlights and turn signals from the Volga GAZ 3129. These rectangular lighting elements themselves made the vehicle look even more similar to the Transit, although they had no connection to Ford. But the similarities were mostly limited to the surface. Beneath the familiar European appearance was a completely different vehicle, a simple, frame-based truck, built mainly from components already mastered by the Gorky automobile plant. In the summer of 1993, the new family was presented at the second Moscow International Motor Show. For many specialists and the vast majority of future buyers, it came as a complete surprise. Most people had no idea that GAZ was developing such a vehicle. Experts following the creation of light-duty trucks were expecting a production model from BAZ, whose project was still under development. Instead, the Gorky automobile plant revealed not just a prototype truck, but an entire family of vehicles that looked modern and matched the new demands of the market. The extensive use of Volga components only increased interest in the newcomer. Buyers understood that the vehicle might not be the most reliable, but it was simple, practical, and easy to repair. If something broke, owners could often fix it themselves. On July 20th, 1994, mass production of the Gazelle began, and demand was immediately high. However, the build quality and reliability of the first Gazelles were, to put it mildly, below average. The vehicle was created during a period of economic transition and launched in a great hurry. The quality of parts from outside suppliers often failed to meet expectations, and assembly at GAZ itself was not always ideal. Real-world use also revealed that the fundamentally successful design suffered from many early problems that could not be solved before production began. While older Soviet models could spend years going through repeated durability and development tests, the Gazelle went from prototype to production vehicle in an extremely short time. Naturally, this affected its reliability. But the combination of practical qualities meant that new Gazelles were quickly bought up. The vehicles went straight into daily work instead of sitting unused, so all their weaknesses became visible very quickly. One of the main problems was the ZMZ 402 engine inherited from the Volga. With a displacement of 2.45 liters and up to 100 horsepower, it was still acceptable for a passenger car. But it struggled with a fully loaded Gazelle. The cooling system was an even bigger issue. In the cramped engine bay, the engine could run excessively hot, even without a serious load, and in summer, a fully loaded Gazelle could quickly overheat and start boiling. That is why on many early vehicles, the front license plate was mounted not in its standard position, but lower or to the side. The reason was that the plate partially blocked the openings that allowed air to reach the radiator. Moving it did not completely solve the problem, but it improved cooling slightly. Later, the factory increased the size of the openings in the bumper, redesigned the radiator, and introduced one of the more important improvements: the ZMZ 406 16-valve engine. It suited the Gazelle better in both power and overall performance, although no engine alone could eliminate all of the vehicle's problems. Overloading became another major issue. With a rated payload of 1.5 tons, Gazelles often carried 2 tons or even more. In these conditions, the strong ladder frame proved especially useful. A unibody design would hardly have handled such abuse with the same confidence. However, corrosion resistance was extremely poor. The metal cargo bed, lower edges of the cab, and exterior body panels rusted especially quickly. Under intensive year-round use, serious rust could appear after only a few years. But demand for the Gazelle did not fall. On the contrary, it grew rapidly. During the incomplete second half of 1994, GAZ produced 13.3 thousand vehicles. In 1995, that figure rose to almost 58,000. Buyers tolerated overheating, rust, and constant breakdowns because, despite all its flaws, the Gazelle allowed its owner to make money. The officially stated average fuel consumption was 12 liters per 100 kilometers. In real-world use, it usually reached 15 to 18 liters, and in city driving or under constant overloads, it could be even higher. But even this was still noticeably lower than the consumption of GAZ or ZIL trucks, which had previously been used to carry small batches of goods. The Gazelle was also actively purchased by government agencies and municipal services. Ambulances, emergency vehicles for gas utilities, police vans, and service vehicles for water companies were all built on its chassis. Many organizations gradually replaced their old trucks with Gazelles. For the Gorky automobile plant itself, the Gazelle also proved to be an exceptionally successful model. During the 1990s, demand for traditional GAZ trucks and Volga sedans fell sharply. Without the Gazelle, the factory could have found itself in an extremely difficult position. The Gazelle was popular not only in Russia, but also across many former Soviet republics, where the economic situation was developing in a similar way. Moreover, at different times, Gazelles were assembled at factories in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Lithuania. By the early 2000s, the Gazelle had been in production for almost 10 years and looked openly outdated. So in 2003, the family received its first major update. The vehicles got new headlights, hood, bumper, and grille, but the biggest change was a completely redesigned interior. The cab was still cheap and simple, but at least it no longer looked as if it had been assembled from leftover Soviet parts. The engines also changed gradually. The old ZMZ 402 gave way to the carbureted ZMZ 406 and the fuel-injected ZMZ 405. The latter pulled a loaded vehicle more confidently, overheated less often, and saved owners from constantly dealing with the carburetor. A GAZ 560 diesel, based on an Austrian Steyr design, was also offered. It was economical and had good low-end torque, but it was too expensive and difficult to repair, so it never became widely used. In 2010, the Gazelle Business appeared. Visually, it changed very little, but some of the weaker components were replaced with imported ones. It received ZF steering, a Sachs clutch, and Bosch components. The vehicle became easier to drive, but the problems with quality and corrosion did not disappear. The main gasoline engine became the UMZ 4216. It was simple, cheap, and pulled well at low revs, but it used a lot of fuel, so many owners converted it to gas. The quality of the early engines was also inconsistent, and the engine never became especially popular with owners. A much better option was the 2.8-liter Cummins diesel introduced in the same year. It had good pulling power, used less fuel than the gasoline engines, and finally matched the Gazelle in both performance and durability. Meanwhile, development of a new generation had already begun in 2006. It reached production in the spring of 2013 under the name Gazelle Next. While the Gazelle Business was usually associated with white paint, the signature color of the Next became bright lime green. The new vehicle received a different cab, independent front suspension, rack and pinion steering, and the familiar Cummins diesel. The frame, rear axle, and leaf springs remained unchanged. The first Next models were shown with aluminum drop sides, making it seem that the problem of the rusting cargo bed had finally been solved. But the basic version still used the old steel platform because it was cheaper and had long been in mass production. The Next was expected to replace the Gazelle Business, but the factory kept both models in production. The new vehicle was more expensive, while the old one remained the cheapest option and already had a huge range of ready-made bodies and conversions. As a result, instead of one generation replacing another, there were two Gazelles for different budgets. Later, the Gazelle NN joined them, but both the Next and the Gazelle Business are still in production today. The Gazelle appeared almost by accident, but at exactly the right moment. A few years earlier, such a vehicle could have remained a useless experiment with no real buyers. A few years later, its place might have already been taken by foreign manufacturers. But the Gazelle arrived first. It did not simply fill an empty niche. It helped create the market for light commercial vehicles across the post-Soviet space. And perhaps the best proof of its success is that more than 30 years later, the word Gazelle no longer means just one specific model. It has become a name for an entire class of vehicles.